All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are back for the second part of this second interview with Ralph Ellis. The first part is obviously going to be linked down below. If you're just happen to catching this video, I recommend you check out the first one before watching this one. Again, it's going to be linked down below. Me and Stan will have that available to you. And we're just going to go ahead and continue, and I'm going to hand it over to Ralph.
Yes, we were in the middle of a very different King Arthur story to the one you're normally told. So just in the break there, we were discussing how we got onto this, and so perhaps we should go back a little bit and look at the British side of this history, because they have linked this story into Britain, as well. Most people know this as being a British story, and they brought this story back and they crafted this new story about this new monarch. But what to do with it, how to make it a part of British history? Well, what they did is they mixed a little bit of British history, a little bit of everything history, and slotted it in. It's quite ingenious in some respects. For instance, Arthur has this strange conception where his father goes off to war, and then Merlin transforms Uther Ben Dragon into looking like, I'm going to have to start this again. Merlin transforms Uther Ben Dragon into looking like someone else so that he could sleep with his wife while her husband was away at war. And it's through this deception that King Arthur is actually conceived. And so his father is Uther Ben Dragon. But of course, that convoluted story is actually the story of the conception of Hercules. So it follows the story of Hercules very, very closely. So what we have here is they've created this Herculean type character based on this demigod Hercules, who now becomes the sort of demigod Arthur. So that's where the birth of Arthur comes from. And then he's born of Uther Ben Dragon, who we all know is the father of King Arthur, except that's not what it says. Very strangely, because most of these manuscripts were written in Latin initially, and then they were later translated into Welsh. So a lot of them were preserved in the Welsh, not in the Latin, even though that was, you know, the second language. And if you look them up in the Welsh, it doesn't say Uther Ben Dragon at all. It says Uther Ben Dragon.
Instead of
with
pen
a Ben,
dragon.
Not a pen. A pen is, you know, if you're down in Cornwall, everyone is called Pen. By Pol, Pen, and something else, you will know the Cornish men. That was a standard sort of name down from Cornwall, and that's what they've thought that it was based upon, meaning head, I suppose, chief, something like that. But that's not what the texts say.
Ben means of, though, right?
Sorry, pen means?
Ben. Ben would mean from or of.
Means son, yes, means son of.
Okay.
Now, they won't believe this because it's Aramaic, of course. It's not Welsh. And they say, but, oh, well, you can't have a name like Ben Dragon because it's Aramaic. Well, firstly, a lot of Welsh is Aramaic, of course, because the most influential book in this region was, of course, the Bible, and it was originally written in Aramaic, and so you get lots of Aramaic names. But the second problem is, if you divorce your mind from the British side of this history and understand that it was taken from the Levant by the Knights Templar, of course, the original history would have been in Aramaic. And that's why we get Aramaic names all the way through Arthurian history. So, I mean, if you look at the magic sword Excalibur, it's actually in Arthurian legend, it's normally called Caliburn. And Caliburn in Aramaic means a sword. So it's very descriptive. It just means sword, you know. If you understand that Aramaic has been used in a lot of these texts. And so we get this name, Uther Ben Dragon. And if you take that as being Aramaic, you get son of a fish, because a dragon, a Dagon in Aramaic is a fish.
That's interesting.
And so his name was Ben Dragon, the son of a fish.
Fisher King.
So what does that mean? Well, if you look at the birth of King Arthur, it says that the symbol that portrayed the birth of King Arthur was this vision in the sky, this comet that they talk about. This comet with two rays that came out of it. And one of the rays signified a son, who was obviously Arthur, and the other ray signified a daughter, who was Guinevere.
Brother and sister.
So this, yeah, brother and sister again, much the same as we've seen before. So this comet had two rays coming out of it. But of course, if you look at the constellation of Pisces, the constellation of Pisces is two rays. That's how it's drawn, with two fish on the end. And more than that, if you go to, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, because it sort of indicates where this all came from. If you go to the Temple of Dendera in Egypt, the Egyptian Temple of Dendera, there is a zodiac, a very famous zodiac on the roof. And it's a very detailed zodiac, exactly the same as we would know our zodiacs today. It's Greco-Egyptian, of course. It's about 2nd century BC or something.
What did you say the name of the building was again?
Dendera Temple. And yeah, if you look up Dendera zodiac, it'll come up with a picture. It's very famous.
Okay.
But if you look at the constellation of Pisces on the zodiac of Dendera, you will see it's in two rays, because that's how the constellation of Pisces is arranged. And there's two fishes at the end, of course. But each fish has a circle by it. One is of Ra, the sun god, and the other one is of Isis, the moon god. A son and a daughter. It's as if, you know, whoever was writing Arthurian legend was sitting there looking at the constellation, at the zodiac of Dendera, and actually writing down what they saw. The comet, as it were, the apparition had two rays ending in a son and a daughter, and he was known as the son of a fish, the son of Pisces.
And you said that was Dogon, right? Dogon?
Dagon, yeah.
Dagon.
It means fish.
Right.
Is that the same Dagon that there's an African nation or tribe that...
Yes. I don't know if they're named after the same thing.
It has something to do with Sirius.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
But that's not what it means in Aramaic. It just means fish.
Okay.
I'm going to bring up an interesting aside real quick, just for the listeners. I don't know if any of our listeners have heard of the Dogon fish tribe, but this is what the Pope's mitre is a fish head.
Right. Yes.
And so it brings that whole thing into it.
Well, of course, the Pope is the continuation of the Fisher Kings. That's why the Pope wears...
He's supposed to be Christ on earth, technically.
And he wears the Fisher ring, remember. He wears the Fisher ring because he was born in the age of Pisces. All of the popes were born in the age of Pisces. That's why in Arthurian legend, we have the whole series of Fisher Kings. The famous kings from Arthurian legend are the Fisher Kings. And the Wounded King. The Wounded King was the eunuch who was castrated. So they were all Fisher Kings because Jesus was the first of the Fisher Kings. That's why he was known as a fisher of men, because he was the first king of the new great month of Pisces. And we've already been through, I think in the last series, we were talking about the great ages, you know, the great months.
Yeah, you had mentioned that
the
King
Zodiac.
Esus Manu the Sixth of Edessa would have been the person responsible for ending the age previous and bringing us into this age of Pisces.
The age of Pisces. And that's why, you know, the Pope, as you say, is connected with the imagery of the fish. That's why in Arthurian legend we have the Fisher Kings, because it was all of the age of Pisces. And of course, within Arthurian legend, the first of the Fisher Kings was Uther Ben Dragon, who was the son of the fish. Uther Ben Dragon. And it clearly says, I have images obviously in the book. The texts do not say Pendragon, the texts say Ben Dragon. And I've pointed this out to Arthurian researchers, serious, you know, academics and scholars, and they say, well, that's just a spelling mistake. I said, well, no, it's not a spelling mistake. It's Ben Dragon. It means something. Oh no, it's Aramaic. You can't have Aramaic in a Welsh. This is a Welsh manuscript. You can't have Welsh in a. So you can't have Aramaic.
I will tell you, since we talked at the beginning, I discovered my ancestry, and I am Welsh, and the Welsh royal tribes, I would say, were very much into the language of the Aramaic, 100%.
Yeah, of course, because the most popular book at that time was the Bible, and the Bible, of course, has a lot of Aramaic in it, even though, you know, many of the editions we have now are Greek. You know, the New Testament was written in Greek, but in many respects, the New Testament, the original text would have been in Aramaic, because that's what they spoke. And
right.
the Greek is a translation of that. So most of the names, I mean, the most common name in Wales, of course, is Davy Jones. David Jones is the most common name you can possibly have in Wales. Wow. And of course, David comes from King David, and Jones comes from Jonah. It's an Aramaic name. It's not a Welsh name at all. It's Aramaic. So, you know, don't tell me that you don't get Aramaic within Welsh texts. And the texts do say Ben Dragon. They don't say Pendragon. So that was a little aside, but it leads us into where this story was hung on to British history. Because, okay,
can I pause you real quick?
The theory is that this story was brought back from the East. And they made up this story, which is the story of the Gospels. It's the same story. Exactly. Or rather, it's the story of the military story, as it were, of the gospel. So this is the story of King Esus Manu of Edessa, the original story about Jesus being a warrior monarch, not a peacenik with sandals and a cloak.
Can I pause you real quick?
What to do? Sorry?
I want to ask you something real quick, if you don't mind. Because in the first 4-part interview, you had mentioned, when we were trying to see some parallels with the Hallett stuff, you had mentioned the idea that King Esus would have been captured by the Romans and possibly put into a Guantanamo Bay of sorts in Britain. So is that kind of where we're going with how...
Yes, eventually.
They
yes,
do all
we shall.
correlate. Okay. I just
because we end up back in Britain. That's partly why the story gets set in Great Britain, because Jesus did end up there, as we talked about before. He ended up there at the end of his life in a prison fortress. And so there was a good reason for setting this story in Britain rather than setting it anywhere else. But you have these Knights Templar, and they have this new story, this real history about a real Jesus who was a real warrior monarch of the 1st century. But what to do with it, because it's heretical. If you tell this story, you're going to be burnt alive, basically. How are you going to cover it up? Well, they hatched a plot to make this alternate story. It's the same story, but, you know, with just different names. And there's a reason for the name Arthur. It's the same as Jesus. We'll We'll go through this in a minute. What to do with it, where to hang it on to normal history. Well, there was an obvious thing to do in that Britain had a dark age. And you can throw any history you like into the dark age and no one will have a clue whether it's true or not, because the dark age was the dark age. We have no history from that era. So you can throw King Arthur into the dark age and no one has any idea whether it's true or not. And so what they did is they chose a particular period of British history where a similar sort of thing happened. And so we have Constantine I, who was born in, was he born in Britain? He was certainly crowned in Britain. So Emperor Constantine I was crowned Emperor of Rome when he was in Lincoln, I think it was. No, was it York? It was either York or Lincoln.
This is the same Constantine with the Council of Nicaea, is that correct?
Yes, yeah, okay. That one. Very great, very powerful Emperor of Rome, and he was born in, certainly, he was crowned in Britain. And there is some confusion with Constantine I, Constantine the Great, but that's not the Constantine they're actually mentioning. When you go through Oxford and Monmouth and their manuscript of Arthurian legend, they're actually talking about Constantine III, who was a century later. So he was crowned in 407. So what happened is Roman rule was coming to an end in Britain. It was getting harder and harder for the Romans to protect Britain against invasions. And the Romans effectively withdrew. And then we asked for, because we got invaded, we asked for a legion. Can we have a legion back, you know, just to, you know, sort out these invasions? They sent a legion back. They sort of cleared out the invaders, and then they retreated back to France again, to Gaul. And this happened on 2 occasions, and the Romans left again. And finally, they elected their own king, as it were, of Britain, who was, well, they called him Constantine. It wasn't his original name. I don't know his original name. Anyway, he came from Brittany. He sailed across to Britain, and he was crowned the king of Britain in Winchester. And he became known as Constantine III. And Constantine III gathered himself his own legion of British warriors and invaded Rome. And he marched on Rome, and he took over the whole of Gaul, he took over the whole of modern Spain, and became the next emperor of Rome. A usurper emperor, you might call. So he didn't last very long. He met up with some opposition in Rome, and he was defeated. So I think he only lasted, when did he last? 4 years. So he was only emperor for 4 years.
Wow.
And if you read Monmouth and Oxford, King Arthur was the grandson of Constantine III, which drops him neatly into the Dark Ages, of course. So it would have made more sense, actually, if they had just said Arthur was Constantine III, because, of course, King Arthur is battling with the Romans and he marches on Rome. He does something very, very similar to Constantine III. But they couldn't do that because it was too obvious, because we know who Constantine III was. And so they made him a grandson of Constantine III. And the problem is that in the time when they set this particular story, the excuse me, the Western Roman Empire didn't really exist. So the battles with Rome that King Arthur was having did not really exist in the time when they set it. So we know this story is not a real history from this era. But yes, that's when they try to hook this story back onto British history by making him a grandson of Constantine III. And the other hook that they put on is that in several of the manuscripts, it mentions that King Arthur was in Galles, and Galles is interpreted as being Wales, because that was the original name for Wales, was Galles. But of course, Galles in a Near Eastern term is actually the Galli high priests of Galilee. That's where the name comes from. So it's not talking about Wales at all. It's talking about Galli, and it's talking about the Galli high priests. And I think we went through the Galli eunuchs in the last talks, didn't we? So we talked about the eunuchs.
Is that where the word Gaelic comes from, though, as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool.
It comes from the same word. So that's where they've hung this history upon. But if you read these texts, they don't read as being a history of Britain. So going back to high history, which we talked about before, high history doesn't mention Britain at all. It mentions many things to do with Joseph of Arimathea. It mentions many things that have biblical sort of connotations, but it doesn't mention Great Britain. And then we have very famous texts like Parsifal by Wolfram von Eschenbach, which is a very famous Arthurian legend. And he starts his history just where you think it should be set. So he starts his Arthurian history in Mesopotamia, where the father of Percival was a knight working for King Barus in Mesopotamia. And so, well, A, we're not talking about Britain here, but B, who is King Barus in Mesopotamia? It can only be King Agbarus. And King Agbarus was the king of Edessa. We've plonked ourselves right back into Edessa, 1st century again. Every time you look at these texts with a critical eye, you end up back in Mesopotamia. Nothing to do with Wales, nothing to do with Northern Europe. The history is set in Mesopotamia. That's where it came from. And it's been dumped in Britain because it was convenient. It was convenient because Britain had had a usurper monarch who had invaded Rome, very much as King Jesus did, because of course, remember in this new story of King Jesus, he was battling the Romans in Judea during the Jewish revolt. That's why Arthurian legend talks about King Arthur battling Romans, because that's exactly what he was doing. It's a story about Jesus in the Near East battling the Romans.
So with what you just said, though, about I think if you said a British king invading Rome, so are you saying that this King Arthur, King Jesus, was actually a monarch in Britain?
No, it was a handy hook to link him onto, because this monarch had done something similar. But the deeds of King Arthur are not the same as Constantine III. I mean, you could, at a stretch, try and make an argument to say that King Arthur was Constantine III, but none of the extraneous events that are around Arthurian legend match what happened in Britain. They match much closer the events that happened in the Near East in the 1st century, not the history of Constantine III.
In the Judea rebellion that took place in 70 AD, roughly.
Yeah, the Jewish revolt. But you couldn't tell that story of the Jewish revolt because it was heretical. But you could tell a story about, a grandson of Constantine III, because that was not heretical. So you could quite happily set the story in Britain in that era. But as I said before, you know, this is not a British story. You know, the manuscripts don't come from Britain. You know, the Scottish version is Roman and Fergus, is the Scottish King Arthur. The Italian version is Florent and Florette, is the Italian King Arthur. The Norman one is Percival, I suppose, and then we have Parzival, which comes from Germany. We have who else do we have?
How does that work, though? I mean, if they have accounts for this in all these different cultures, is it just variations of the same story being told in different ways, or did this individual visit these places?
No. Yeah, good question. It was a local version of the Arthurian story. So it was the Arthurian story with local names for the various characters.
Okay.
So if you look at Roman de Fergus, which is the Scottish one, Percival, who's one of the chief knights of King Arthur, was called Fergus. And I don't know why they bothered changing his name, but anyway, they did. So he becomes Fergus. Same with Florent and Florette, which is the Italian version. This is where King Arthur is buried in Mount Etna. So we have all these different versions of the same story.
You say King Arthur buried in Mount Etna?
Yeah, in the Italian version.
Okay. I mean, now this is a way, I guess, too, though, of having it. If it's in all these different cultures as a different person or whatever, it's still keeping that truth hidden in this story, and it's keeping it spread out amongst different cultures as well, which keeps that story relevant.
Yes, it does, but it wouldn't keep it relevant if Arthur was a British king, because no one would be interested in a British king. Britain was not a very important part of the empire at the time, especially after the empire had started breaking up in the early 5th century. So why would all of these different countries hold on their own version of the same story? It's because this was a very famous king who was pertinent to all of the countries of Europe. And the only person who fits that bill, of course, is King Jesus, King Jesus Manu of Edessa, because Christianity populated all of these regions, and all of these regions would have been interested in the real history of the King Jesus, because they all knew who this guy was in the guise of the Gospels. But what they didn't know was the real historical truth as to who this guy was. And so they created these stories all around Europe to hold the history, the real true history of the King Jesus story.
Sorry, go ahead, Sam.
I was going to say, so where does this start leading us into Jesus being buried at Stonehenge?
Well, before we get there, though, I'm just curious. You mentioned something about the name Arthur, Arthur, comparing it to the Isis Manu and how it would translate. Can you explain that too? And then we can get to the Stonehenge stuff.
It does link to Stonehenge, I suppose, as well, but it links to what we've been saying before. It links back to the Zodiac. So all of this is connected to the Zodiac. That's why Uther Ben Dragon was the constellation of Pisces, because this was the new age of Pisces. So all of this is based upon the Zodiac. So yeah, that's another point. In Arthurian legend, there were 3 tables. So the first round table was the round table of King Jesus. So the Last Supper table. Yeah, table of the Last Supper was a round table with 12 disciples. The next one was the round table of Joseph of Arimathea and his 12 disciples. And the third one was the round table of King Arthur and his 12 knights. So the 12 disciples of Jesus are the same as the 12 knights of King Arthur. It's the same story, it's the same round table. But that round table was actually a zodiac, which is why we have the great Jewish zodiac at Hamat Tavera on the Sea of Galilee. So, we've discussed this before, so I'll go through it very quickly. The major symbol of Nazarene Judaism was the zodiac, and every synagogue of that era has a zodiac on the floor. So we know it was the central symbol of Nazarene Judaism. And so we have this zodiac. And if you look at the one at Hamat Tavera, the central item, very strangely actually, but the central character in the middle of the zodiac is Helios. And remember, this is a Jewish zodiac made by Jews, made by Nazarene Jews. It was owned by Jesus. We know that because Josephus Flavius says so. It was owned by Jesus. And the central character, obviously the kingly character, the sun, is Helios and his chariot riding across, you know, the cosmos. And strangely enough, just as an aside, he carries in his hand a blue-green spherical earth. This is 1st century. So they knew in that time that the earth was a blue-green sphere that was held in the gravitational grip of Helios, the sun.
So you're saying the earth isn't flat?
Not even in the 1st century. But not only that, they knew the heliocentric system of the solar system, because they knew the earth was in the grasp of the sun. Here comes the comments.
So, he's a Mason.
Bring it, people.
So we're also, for the audience, could you kind of explain what was the purpose of the zodiac? So in case they didn't catch that or catch the first one.
Oh, from the previous one. Yeah, it was its main reason, well, apart from prophecy and things of that nature, its main reason was a millennial calendar. So it was a millennial calendar that would keep a history of civilization of the world. So if you built a large lion as your main symbol, like the Sphinx, you can sort of guarantee that it was made in about 10,000 BC, because that was the great month of Leo.
Based on the precession of the equinox.
Through the precession of the equinox. And if you allied yourself with bulls, as they do in, you know, the Old Testament, then you're talking about the great month of Taurus, which was about 4,500 BC up to 1700 BC. And then if you change to sheep and shepherds, if you become a lamb of God, then you're talking about the great month of Aries, which was 1750 BC up until, say, 10 AD. And then if you're talking about becoming a fisher of men, then you're talking about AD 10 onwards. And so we have this great millennial calendar, so you can keep track of the monarchs and the civilizations. So it's very useful. And it was used for prophecy and many other reasons, of course, as well. So we have these great zodiacs, and the table of King Arthur is a zodiac. And so the Arthur character is not sitting around the perimeter of the table. The Arthur character should be sitting in the middle of the table, the same as they do on a zodiac. The kingly character sits in the center. So there was a hole in the center of the table, and King Arthur would sit in the hole in the center of the table. And that was a zodiac, of course. And if you look at a zodiac, you've got two possibilities. You can either have a solar zodiac, so you can look, as it were, upwards at the sky. Or are you looking downwards? You're probably looking downwards. Anyway, you can either have the sun surrounded by all of the constellations. And that's what we see in the Hamat Tavera zodiac. We get the sun in the center, 12 constellations around the outside. Or you can look up at the night sky, and if you do that, what you see is the northern stars surrounded by the 12 constellations. And the northern star is Ursa Major and the Great Bear. And the name for King Arthur comes from Ursa Major. That's where it comes from. Arthur was the Great Bear, Ursa Major. So the central component in the center of a zodiac can either be the sun god figure, Helios, Ra, Aton, Jesus, or it can be the Great Bear, the Arthur character, who is the center of the zodiac. And that's why Arthur was chosen as a pseudonym, for the sun god character Jesus.
This is amazing stuff, man.
Yeah, it sort of fits together. You know, this is what I like about the work that I do, is that I say it's either, you know, it's either a crossword puzzle, or it's a normal puzzle with pieces. And if you have a puzzle and you start to fit pieces together, if you're trying to force it to fit, none of the pieces will actually match up. You know, you'll have to be screwing pieces together because they don't match. The fact that this jigsaw puzzle all matches up and the pieces all drop into position can only occur if you are following a true history. Otherwise, you would have to be forcing pieces in all the time. And I don't have to force any pieces in whatsoever. They just drop in, just like that. In fact, it becomes predictive. I don't think we ever talked about the Huqoq Mosaic, did we? So I did this King Jesus book, and I had this image of Jesus, which I'd made based upon him being a king of Edessa. He would be dressed in a certain fashion, because that's how the kings of Edessa dressed. And he would have long hair, a payot, because he was a Jew, you know, one of the curly side locks of hair that they have. He would have a long beard. He would be ginger, because I traced this ginger family, because, you know, many of the pharaohs of Egypt were ginger haired and so on. I go through all of this in the books. He would be wearing Roman armor. He would be wearing a purple cloak fashioned with a fibula on his chest. He would be wearing a kilt, you know, a standard Roman kilt. He would be wearing stockings, because the Edessans and the Persians all wore stockings. The Romans and Greeks didn't, of course. There's a big difference between the two, but the Persians used to wear stockings. And anyway, so I wrote this book. I had this image. It's on the front of my book. And about 4 years later, they were doing a dig up in Israel, just to the northwest of Galilee, at a place called Huqoq, and they discovered some mosaics. And one of the mosaics was of this very strange scene. And this is why I don't like academia, because they don't seem to know what on earth they are doing sometimes. They really don't.
Or they do, and they're doing it on purpose.
Well, they did, yes. They sold this story. This is what I hate about them, you know. They came across this mosaic of this kingly character with his army and 2 elephants, and he's giving a calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. And all the priests are actually armed with swords. You know, this is not actually a friendly meeting, but there we go. And then in a lower register, the army of this king is all defeated. So what does this story mean? You know, it's obviously telling a story. All of the other mosaics were items from the Old Testament. You know, the building of the Tower of Babel and the Exodus and the Jewish spies going into Judea and so on. All famous extracts from the Tanakh. So what does this odd one out mean? Because it's not obviously from the Tanakh. So the archaeologists on site, and remember the archaeologists have their own interpreters. They would have, you know, Jewish historians there as well, not just archaeologists. They would have, because it's a Jewish dig, it's in Israel, you know, they'd have people who had obviously born and bred and at university in Judea. And they said, oh, well, maybe it's a scene of Antiochus, who invaded Judea circa, I don't know, 3rd century BC. You know, he was a Greek king. Didn't really fit. But then National Geographic got into it. And of course, National Geographic wanted a scoop. What do you call it when they have a scoop? Anyway, they wanted to tell this story first.
That's basically it, a scoop. You got the first information. You want to make sure you get it out there.
Yeah. And so they put an embargo on the images. They wouldn't let anyone have the images. So this image was held back for more than a year, and no one could actually see what it was.
By National
And
Geographic?
then, yeah, by National Geographic. It's called the Huqoq Mosaic. Huqu.
Okay.
I forget how it's spelled.
Okay,
now.
that's enough though.
You found it?
No, I was writing it down. I've just been taking notes throughout this entire conversation because you fascinate me to the point that I got to write down stuff.
Huqoq, I think it is, Huqoq. So they then released this great scoop they had, this exclusive on this dig. And they said, here is an image of Alexander the Great in Judea, because Alexander the Great did go down through Judea when he went to Egypt, of course. He was sort of went through there en route. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute, Alexander the Great? Here is a king who's long-haired with a beard. Alexander the Great never has long hair with a beard. And he's wearing a Jewish side lock of hair. So this is, you know, this is Alexander the Jew. No, I don't. I don't think so. And quite obviously, this lead archaeologist had sold this story to National Geographic for X thousands of dollars, so they could have this exclusive, put it on the front of their magazine. And because it was National Geographic, they didn't want any unknown story. So they picked someone nice and famous like Alexander the Great and said, this is Alexander the Great, because it made a great headline to their story. Absolute rubbish. Because I knew exactly what this mosaic was, because I'd written about it 4 years before it was even discovered. And that's why I like my work, because it's predictive. It actually tells us what's going to be discovered in the future. Because the person in this mosaic is Bar Kamsa. And you're going to say, who? What?
Who's Bar Kamsa?
Bar Kamsa?
Nobody knows what Bar Kamsa was. Even when I talk to people who should know better, you know, theologians and Jewish historians, they don't know who Bar Kamsa is. Bar Kamsa is a character from the Talmud. He is the leader of the Jewish revolt. So we were talking before about how these names change.
Is that the mosaic right there?
That's the one, yes, with the king and his army and the 2 elephants on the right side. And he's giving a calf, a very young calf by the looks of it, to the high priest on the left side.
Yeah, and to get the spelling for that for people, because this did pull up the National Geographic website, and it says, explore the mysterious mosaic it portrays. It may portray Alexander the Great. Yeah.
Very interesting. Actually, the National Geographic one is the best one to pull up because it has the best images, because they got the exclusive on this story.
And it is Huqoq. That would be correct.
So where does this fit into my story? Well, Bar Kamsa, so in the Talmud, it has this story which fits straight into my book, Jesus, King of Edessa. Because the story is that Emperor Nero, so we're talking the right era, of course, Emperor Nero gave a calf which was taken to the high priesthood by Bar Kamsa, this strange person, Bar Kamsa, who is said in the Talmud to have been the leader of the Jewish revolt. And he gave this calf to the high priest of Jerusalem in order for it to be rejected, because it was a Gentile calf. It wasn't a Jewish, you know, sacred calf. And more than that, he cut its lip on purpose. And in that picture, you'll see that the cow has a little cut on his left lip. He cut its lip because only a perfect calf could be sacrificed in the temple. And so what Bar Kamsa wanted was the high priest to refuse the calf and therefore give a slight against Rome, against Nero the emperor, and therefore start the Jewish revolt. So he was looking for a dispute between the temple priests and Rome, and that's what he caused by giving this calf to the high priest of Jerusalem. And so that is why this mosaic is in this synagogue, because this was a momentous event in Judaic history. This was the very start of the Jewish revolt. This was the pivotal event that started the Jewish revolt. But from my research, of course, it was doubly interesting because this guy was supposed to be the leader of the Jewish revolt, Bar Kamsa. And the leader of the Jewish revolt was the biblical Jesus. That was the whole thrust of the whole of my book. So on this mosaic, this is the earliest depiction we get of the biblical Jesus.
Wow. Yeah, they do have a good image. I got it too. Yeah.
That's the guy. And of course, he is just as I described King Jesus on the front of my book. So he has the diadema headband, so he was a king. He's got long hair and a beard because the Nazarenes always had long hair. That was the whole thing about the Nazarene. They weren't allowed to cut their hair. His hair is ginger, which is exactly what I said about King Jesus. And he's wearing a purple cloak because if you read the crucifixion of Jesus, he was, of course, crucified while wearing a purple cloak because he was a pretender to the throne of Rome. Only the emperor was allowed to wear a purple cloak.
Wow.
And so it shows the intent of this king of Edessa, this Jesus character. He was intending to take over Rome. So yeah, that was just one of these nice little points that fitted in, one of these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, which fitted in so nicely.
So to get to Stonehenge, and I'm not trying to rush you, how much information is there before we get to that point?
Well, we can sort of head in that direction almost straight away, really.
Okay.
What happened is that within the story I wrote in King Jesus and Jesus, King of Edessa, because Jesus was the leader of the Jewish revolt and it failed, he was captured and sent into exile. And he was sent into exile in Fortress Diwa, which is up in Chester in northwest modern England.
It's now a shopping center, as we talked about.
Which is the shopping center, yes. So he was incarcerated there, and he would have spent, he was incarcerated there in about AD 74. The fortress was built in AD 72, just after the Jewish revolt. He was incarcerated there when it was built in AD 74. And he would have been there until about, I think he died in about AD 92, maybe AD 95. So he was quite old when he died. I think he was born probably in AD 15. So he would have been sort of 80 years old, which is not unusual for that sort of era, for a well-fed royal. And so we have this famous rebel character, the biblical King Esus Manu. What do you do with this guy?
You mean, are we talking theoretically if he's in this Guantanamo Bay and he dies there? What do you do with his body?
Yeah. I mean, you can't send it back to the East. You know, if you send anything back to the East, it's going to be used to foment, another revolt, You can't disrespect his body. I mean, they just kept him for 20 years for a start, so you're not going to disrespect his body by, throw it in the sea maybe or something. What are you going to do with this body that keeps it away from his power base in the Near East, and yet gives it some sort of respect that, it's due? Because, I mean, this guy was supposed to be a son of God. At the very least, he was linked to the royal thrones of Egypt, Persia, Rome, Greece, You know, he was the
all
most
the
well-connected.
bloodlines. Yeah, he was all the blood.
All of those bloodlines.
Yeah, the fulfillment of all the bloodlines.
Yeah, he was the central character in that era, who could have united the whole of the sort of known world, as it were. So he needed to be buried with some sort of respect. So what are you going to do with his body? Well, the interesting thing is that in Arthurian legend, Monmouth and Oxford, so we're going back to the earliest of the manuscripts that were written, Monmouth and Oxford say that the father and the son of King Arthur were both buried at Stonehenge.
The father and son of King Arthur were both buried at Stonehenge, per the Monmouth gentleman. Yeah. Okay.
So, was King Arthur buried there as well? Because it would make, I mean, it's only pure speculation because there is no particular evidence, but it would make sense. It would make a logical place to actually put the remains of this King Esus Arthur character, because Stonehenge was abandoned at that time, of course. There were no more Druids. There was nobody venerating that site. But it was a well-known site within Roman history, because the Roman road goes right beside it. So the Romans obviously knew about it because they built a Roman road that's, you know, within about 50 meters of it. So we have an abandoned site here, which is still a big sacred space. Okay, it wasn't Roman, but it was a vast temple that was abandoned and could well be used as a cemetery.
It could have been disrespectful though, too, as well, though. I mean, because if Esus Manu wasn't a druid or any type of paganistic religion, which is what I understand the druids to come from, then that would be almost like a slap to his face by burying him at a place like that, in a way.
Not
that's
really,
what I'm thinking.
because remember, he was the central component in the round table. He was the central component in the round Last Supper table, and as King Arthur, he was the central component in the Arthurian round table. And what is Stonehenge but a large round table?
I was going to say, isn't Stonehenge something in relation to the Zodiac and the way that it lines up with certain times of the day or certain times of the year, the way the light comes through the different parts of how the stones were placed upon each other?
It's a celestial temple, exactly the same as a zodiac is a celestial temple. And of course, remember that the primary symbol of Nazarene Judaism was the zodiac and a celestial temple. And Stonehenge is a celestial temple that is circular and round, exactly the same as the zodiac on the Sea of Galilee, which was owned by Jesus himself, because Josephus Flavius says it was owned by Jesus, the biblical Jesus. It would be a perfectly logical and a very respectful place to actually build them. Now, if these temples, you weren't allowed to bury people in if they were when they were functioning places. You know, we've done lots of archaeology around all of these henges and so on in Britain and Europe. People were not buried in temples. Christianity, I think, is the only religion that allows people to be buried in their temples, you know, because the body is what do you call it? Not corruptible. It's profane. It's not pure. It's not spiritual. You cannot bury. Yeah, man. You cannot bury a body within a temple.
That makes sense. It's like desecration.
Except in a Christian one, of course, where you see burials in every cathedral and every church everywhere. Christianity is the only religion that does that. So these temples, when they were being used, places like Avebury and Stonehenge and all of the other big henges around Britain, would not have had any burials in them. Which is why I hate it when archaeologists dig up a burial in Stonehenge and they say, oh, look, this must be the era of Stonehenge. No, if you found a body there, that means that's the era when Stonehenge was no longer being used as a sacred site, because you don't bury bodies in a sacred site. But of course, in the Roman era, Stonehenge was no longer being used. It was no longer a sacred site. And so it could have been used as a burial location. And so as Jesus was the center of the Hamat Tavera zodiac, then surely he was buried in the center of Stonehenge.
Oh, so you think it would be in the center as well?
Well, yeah, that's the place of, you know, the Arthurian character, because the sun is at the center of the zodiac, and so is Ursa Major, the Arthur character, is at the center of the zodiac. And so that's the logical place where you would bury someone.
All right, let's mark this time span, see how many people start going out to dig.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're getting in the tail end of wrapping this up, but one of the things I want to say, Ralph, is I cannot, you know, thank you enough for the time that you spent in your life doing this research. And, you know, I mean, obviously this is something that, you know, it's not written in our history books. It's not something that somebody else is going to sit here for the most part in mainstream and agree with what you're saying. But it's fascinating. You back a lot of this up by logic and fact. I think it's really intensely crazy when you think about this in retrospect. In our conversation so far, is you've connected this Isis Manu, the King Isis Anu of Edessa, to being the great grandson of Cleopatra the sixth or seventh, seventh, and Julius Caesar, and then now we're talking about in the original first interview about how that the biblical Jesus and historical Jesus. Then we get into the Arthurian legend, and then how that reconnects all that, and how, if I remember correctly, you didn't even know about Edessa. You had just found this out, but Edessa just keeps making its way in front of you, just to keep saying, I'm here
all the time. Yeah, I was so surprised when it turned up in Arthurian legend as well, you know, as being the, you know, the focus of where it probably came from. And yes, this is a new history. It is speculative in some respects, but for listeners who have not read my books, all of this comes from original manuscripts. So one thing that's different in my work is I don't read, in general, other historians. I try, if ever possible, to go back to the original manuscripts and work my way through them myself, so I'm not being influenced by what other people have said, and I can see it with fresher eyes. So although this is what some people might say as speculative history, everything is referred back to real history that we know of. It's just been interpreted in a slightly different fashion, not a very different fashion, by myself, and that gives a very different story to the traditional one. And we don't have to do very much to tease out the new story. All we're doing is changing the Gospels by 40 years. I mean, it's not a big change, really. And suddenly we find this new vista, this new version of the New Testament. And I do the same with the Old Testament as well. We haven't gone through that, but I do exactly the same with the Old Testament, and you can find the whole of the Old Testament within the history that we know as well, just by changing one or two things. And then I was very surprised about Arthurian legend, because here was another story that came along. And like Edessa, when I didn't know anything about Edessa before I started writing the book, I didn't know anything about Arthurian legend either. But then you go into Arthurian legend and suddenly you see it supporting all of the work that I'd done previously, which is why I'm pretty convinced that the Arthurian legend is a retelling of the same story I made about King Isis of Edessa. It is the same story because it all links up again. All of the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle fit together, and I don't have to force them. They just
I
drop in.
also want to say too, I wasn't trying to diminish your work by any means. I just, it's what people have been taught as history, and now we have to break that cognitive dissonance that's going. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because some people, you can throw the truth in front of people's faces and they can see it, but it just conflicts with their beliefs so much that no matter what you say or what kind of facts that you show to present it to be truthful, they're just going to deny it, and that's just a complete psychological thing, just because they don't want it to change the way they think, because it just breaks their paradigm.
And even worse, and I found it more shocking, but historians are the worst at this. You can imagine a Christian or a Jew hanging on to their belief system because that's all they've got. They've only got the one version. But I was very surprised that historians will do the same, because they have their historical structures that they've created and they've taught. And they can't change them, because that changes the whole history that they've been teaching. So you can imagine you've got a venerable historian, academic, working in a university, and a great university like Cambridge or Oxford or something, and they've been teaching this history for 40 years, and then blogs comes along, myself, and says, actually, everything you've been teaching for the last 40 years is wrong, actually. Sorry. And of course, they won't accept it, because, how can you accept it?
It shatters their whole history and their whole...
It does.
What's wrong with admitting that we may have made mistakes in history with the way that we have deciphered things to happen, and that we have come to the conclusion that things aren't exactly true, and we're going to right those wrongs?
It's difficult. That's why they say that academia only advances one death at a time, because you've got to clear out the old generation before you can get new ideas to come in at the bottom, because that's the only way you're going to influence people. The only way I can influence academia is by influencing the new students coming in, at the bottom of academia.
Well, Ralph,
and hopefully they'll rise up, in many years' time and become tutors and academics themselves. And we might get some new ideas. It's possible. You never know.
That would be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, to be honestly fair too. So how much would you say of yourself if your research is malleable and, open to change? Well, it's open to change, but no one can challenge it. You see, I was very reticent about writing about this and going public with this when I first started this many, many years ago. First book was published in '96, I think. Because who am I to be challenging the establishment? And I was sort of convinced that if I wrote something like this and put it into print, that someone within academia would come out and show the mistakes I had made and make myself look a complete fool. So I was very reticent to put out the first of the books, because I thought I could be tripped up. There must be something I've missed in this new story I'd created. And nobody is being able to do that. We have another guest, Bronnie. She's bringing up Apollonius Isis Christus of Tyana. Are you familiar with that story?
Tyana.
Yeah, Apollonius Isis
Christus
of Tyana.
Yes. Yes, I've sort of read that. It's a sort of parallel story, but it's a very Roman Gentile version, which is why I don't think it can be. It might be a parody of the sort of gospel events, but I don't think it's an actual history of the gospel events, because it's written from a very Gentile point of view, very critical point of view. But it could be someone writing a criticism of the sort of gospel events. We do have this. You've only got to look at Appian, who wrote a critique of Judaism. And Josephus Flavius, of course, hated it because he said it was full of untruths and lies. And so he wrote against Appian, which was pointing out all of the errors that Appian had made. So there were many critics who would quite happily make a parallel story that was the complete opposite of the original story. So that was Apollonius of Tyana, I think.
Yep.
I did read it at one point, but I didn't go into it because I couldn't see any direct parallels with what I had written. It didn't seem to be the same story.
Well, I'm sure that if Bronnie is watching this and she has some information that she could get to you, we know your email address, and we will definitely provide you some information. But
absolutely,
everything that we talked about today in this 2-part interview has to do with your book, The Grail Cypher. So if you could remind people how they can find you on the internet to be able to purchase your awesome literature.
Yes, so the easiest way to get hold of this book, because I don't hold stocks anymore, I just use print on demand. So the easiest way is to go onto Amazon, and they have tablet books, and they have the print on demand ones, which is great because you always end up with the latest version. So most of my books, the latest versions are 2017 or later, and Amazon has a big long list of them there. My website is edfu-books.com, so that's EDFU, edfu-books.com. And I have a Facebook site as well, which is fairly active. I keep that going quite a lot. There's a lot of good, because Facebook is one of the few places that I can easily use with commentary on the bottom, because my website, I could never make the comments section work at the bottom very easily. But Facebook, it's very easy. So we have lots of commentary on Facebook, and that is Ralph Ellis 144, 12 by 12, of course.
I'll have to look for that, because I mean, I know that we've talked on Facebook, or I think I found you on Facebook, but I haven't found any groups that you've started. So I definitely would.
Okay, no, Ralph Ellis 144. It's the father of Percival was 144, 12 by 12. He was the 12th of the 12th.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, that's awesome.
And you've got your YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, I've got the YouTube channel. Yeah, actually, there's a lot of commentary on there as well, because I get notifications when people make postings on YouTube. So it's quite easy.
And you also go through the comments of the interviews that you've done with us as well. So, I mean, people, if you have questions for Ralph, he's very accessible. So feel free to leave comments. And
yes, I've been commenting on there recently as well, haven't I? I've forgotten to go there recently. I'll have to go back and have a look. The trouble is, you see, I don't get notifications from your YouTube sites. So I've got to actually go on there and have a look.
It's all right. It's all right. But I mean, honestly, I really honestly personally appreciate your time. And I know we're going to have more conversations, but before we wrap it up on this end, Stan, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just want to ask Ralph, what's your next video you're working on coming out?
The next one coming out is the continuation of the Old Testament series. So in the one that was out previously, we sort of got up to the, where did we get to? We were getting up to the sort of Exodus, and how the Exodus was part of real history. And then I follow on in the next video, and that'll be out in just the beginning of next month. I'll put that out. And that follows in through the Exodus and some of the other bits of the Old Testament. So I do a whole series on the Old Testament. I've got 4 books, I suppose, on the Old Testament, putting that back into real history. And obviously, I say all of these events from the Old Testament came from real history, if you know how to interpret it. Because none of this history is obviously visible in the historical record. And, that's been my life's work, is finding all of these elements.
Well, you did mention the Exodus. The Exodus story. We brought the Wikipedia stuff in regards to the very first part of the 4-part interview that we did with you the first time. So
yeah,
that was kind of like your proof of this is what revisionary theology is. This is me taking biblical events and replacing it back in real time.
Yes. So I did that, and I did the one on King Solomon, because I say he's a real king as well. That's on YouTube as well. And that's quite interesting, because that's sort of more recent history. It's more accessible in that there's more real history to look at. And again, he can't be found in the historical record, but I did manage to find him in the historical record by looking back into Egypt once more. So that's an interesting video as well. It's an interesting talk as well. You know, we could talk about that at some point.
I would love to. I'm very intrigued by the biblical elements. I would like to know more because he seemed to play a very important role in the Bible, especially. So, I mean, I think it would be really important.
Yeah, he did. And he turned out to be an Egyptian as well. So again, it changes the story slightly, which is why they don't want you to know about it, because they don't want you to know he was an Egyptian. But again, the story all fits together, like in this, you know, Arthurian legend. You know, we have another jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces slot in. I was just surprised how easily all of the pieces slotted together to make a real comprehensive story about the United Monarchy. Yeah, interesting stuff.
It's amazing, man. And I mean, obviously, I mean, I get blown away every time I talk to you. So I look forward to all of our mini conversations that are to come. And I want to let everybody know that, you know, obviously all three of us have our own YouTube channel. So if you like what we're doing, make sure you subscribe to all of our channels. Going to have links down below. I'm going to have links down below for everything that Ralph mentioned about how you can find his books and find his website, Facebook page, and all that good stuff. Everything that we talked about, you're going to have links down below. I just want to say on behalf of everybody, I appreciate everybody watching.
Yeah, thanks. And Ralph, one last thing right before we end. What do you say to those who question you being a Mason in your research?
Or that you're even putting out disinformation on purpose.
Yeah. Oh, well, I am a Mason, of course. So, I mean, there's no secret there. I don't make it a secret. But none of this has come from Masonic sources. And I've been surprised because I didn't become a Mason until fairly late in life, I suppose. I became a Mason about 15, 20 years ago. And I was sort of expecting there to be something there, but it seemed rather hollow. There were no real major secrets, and they certainly didn't know any of this. None of this information has come from Masonic sources. I mean, some of the secrets of Masonry are, well, I'll give you a secret of Masonry, and this sort of shows where it's going to. So this is the first major secret you are given as a Freemason.
Are we going to get in trouble for you telling us this?
First degree.
Is something going to happen to us for you telling us?
Yeah, yeah. I can only tell you if I kill you after this. No, it's nothing like that. So this is from the first degree. It's one of the first major secrets you are told. And the secret is, if you're ready for this.
We're ready.
The secret is that the Earth orbits the sun.
Are you a comedian as well? And we didn't know about this.
Now, think about it. This is not 18th century. This is not 1707 and the founding of Grand Lodge. This is Knights Templar. And the secret is that the Earth rotates about the sun. Remember, this is heretical. This is information that you're not allowed to have. This is deep and secret information. Now, to you and me, of course, this is normal. You know, we have surpassed the secrets of Masonry, and most people know these secrets as a matter of course. But in the 12th century, 12th century, this was a great secret. And it was a prize that you had to keep secret because you could be burnt at the stake. Galileo was ostracized, you know, he was in house arrest. Bruno was burnt at the stake for saying things that were similar. You can see why it was kept as a secret within a secret organization, and you only found out about this information by initiation. However, you know, we have surpassed most of the secrets of Masonry. And this material didn't come from Masonic sources.
That's kind of a letdown, man. I thought there would be like some really cool information, secrets. I thought you were going to just tell us something really mind-blowing, but you told us the Earth revolves around the sun.
I mean, if you're taking it back to way back
no,
then.
it makes complete sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But obviously,
I thought there were modern secrets.
We probably could all admit there's probably, you know, you've got your good faction and bad faction, just like everything else.
There's dualities of everything.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
100%. So
And so, ladies and gentlemen, Ralph is cool.
Ralph is cool peoples. We vet him. I like Ralph. He's good people, and this conversation will always be continued.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
We've got lots to discuss. Yeah.
Yep.